1962. Rome, the Cleopatra set. $350 million. That is what Cleopatra cost in today's money, making it the most expensive film ever made at that time. Every scene, every minute, every second was worth gold. And Elizabeth Taylor, sitting on her golden throne in her legendary costume, was about to risk all of it with a single decision. A producer had rushed to her side and whispered something in her ear. Outside the set, a young girl was waiting. She was very ill, and doctors had told her family that her time was limited. Her only wish was simple: to see the real Cleopatra. Elizabeth Taylor had faced death herself just 1 year earlier. During the early Cleopatra filming in London, she had contracted severe pneumonia. Her lungs had filled with fluid, she could not breathe, and doctors had performed an emergency tracheotomy to save her life. She had been minutes away from death. That experience had changed her forever. So when she heard about the little girl waiting outside, she did not hesitate for even a second. She stood up from her throne and commanded the entire production to stop. The producers panicked. Every minute of delay cost thousands of dollars. But Elizabeth Taylor did not care about money. She never had. That night in Rome, something happened that would prove Elizabeth Taylor was not just a movie star. She was something far more rare, a genuinely good human being. If you love stories about the real hearts behind Hollywood's greatest legends, make sure to subscribe to this channel right now. We bring you the untold stories that reveal who these icons truly were. Hit that subscribe button and join our family, but before we get to what happened that night on the Cleopatra set, we need to go back. We need to understand the extraordinary journey that brought Elizabeth Taylor to Rome, and the near-death experience that transformed her into the woman who would stop the most expensive film in history for a child's wish. The information in this video is compiled from documented interviews, archival news, books, and historical reports. For narrative purposes, some parts are dramatized and may not represent 100% factual accuracy. We also use AI-assisted visuals and AI narration for cinematic reconstruction. The use of AI does not mean the story is fake. It is a storytelling tool. Our goal is to recreate the spirit of that era as faithfully as possible. Enjoy watching. Elizabeth Taylor was born on February 27, 1932 in London, England, to American parents. Her extraordinary beauty was evident from infancy, with her famous violet eyes and dark hair captivating everyone who saw her. When her family moved to Los Angeles to escape World War II, young Elizabeth's destiny in Hollywood became inevitable. She was signed to a studio contract at 9 years old and became a star at 12 with National Velvet. But unlike many child stars, Elizabeth Taylor successfully transitioned into adult stardom, becoming one of the most sought-after actresses of her generation. By the late 1950s, she had won Academy Awards and commanded the highest salaries in the industry. But fame had come at a cost. Elizabeth had endured multiple marriages, public scandals, and health problems that would have broken most people. Through it all, she maintained a kindness and generosity that those who knew her always remembered. In 1958, 20th Century Fox announced plans to make Cleopatra an epic retelling of the Egyptian queen's legendary life and loves. The studio initially planned a modest production, but as the project developed, it grew into something unprecedented. They wanted the biggest sets, the most elaborate costumes, the most spectacular scenes ever filmed, and they wanted Elizabeth Taylor as their Cleopatra. When Fox approached Taylor about the role, she was exhausted from recent films and personal troubles. To discourage them, she demanded what she thought was an impossible sum: $1 million. No actress had ever been paid that much for a single film. To her shock, the studio agreed. Elizabeth Taylor became the first woman in cinema history to earn $1 million salary. But that was just the beginning of Cleopatra's astronomical costs. Have you ever been part of something that grew so big it seemed impossible to control? That was Cleopatra. Let us know in the comments about a time when a project in your life spiraled beyond all expectations. Filming began in London in September of 1960, and almost immediately everything went wrong. The English weather was terrible, with constant rain and cold making outdoor filming nearly impossible. The sets, built at enormous expense at Pinewood Studios, were frequently unusable. Worse still, Elizabeth Taylor's health began to deteriorate. She had always been prone to respiratory problems. And the damp London climate aggravated her condition severely. She missed day after day of filming, and the production fell further and further behind schedule. The costs mounted with every delay. Sets stood empty while crews waited. Actors' contracts had to be extended. The studio watched in horror as their budget spiraled out of control. In March of 1961, Elizabeth Taylor's health crisis reached a terrifying climax. What had seemed like a persistent cold turned into severe pneumonia. Her lungs filled with fluid, and she struggled desperately to breathe. Doctors rushed her to the hospital, where her condition continued to deteriorate. At one point, her heart stopped. The medical team fought frantically to revive her. When it became clear that she could not breathe on her own, doctors made the decision to perform an emergency tracheotomy, cutting into her throat to create an airway. Elizabeth Taylor was literally minutes from death. News of her critical condition spread around the world. Fans gathered outside the hospital, praying for her recovery. Headlines announced that the world's most beautiful woman was fighting for her life. Against all odds, Elizabeth survived. She would carry a small scar on her throat for the rest of her life, a permanent reminder of how close she had come to losing everything. If you are finding this story compelling, please take a moment to subscribe. Your support helps us continue bringing these incredible true stories to life. Elizabeth Taylor's brush with death changed her profoundly. Before the pneumonia, she had been focused primarily on her career and her personal dramas. After her recovery, something shifted inside her. She spoke later about how facing death had given her a new perspective on what truly mattered. Fame, money, and accolades suddenly seemed less important than human connection and compassion. She became more attentive to the struggles of others, more willing to use her enormous platform to help those in need. This transformation would define the rest of her life and career, leading eventually to her groundbreaking work, raising awareness and funds for AIDS research in the 1980s. But long before that, on a film set in Rome, the world would get its first glimpse of the woman Elizabeth Taylor had become. After Elizabeth's illness, it became clear that London was not suitable for filming Cleopatra. The production was shut down completely, and the decision was made to move everything to Rome's famous Cinecittà studios. This relocation alone cost millions of dollars. New sets had to be built from scratch. The London sets, including elaborate recreations of ancient Alexandria, were abandoned and eventually dismantled. In Rome, the production started fresh, constructing some of the largest and most detailed film sets in cinema history. A full-scale replica of the Egyptian capital rose on the Italian sound stages, complete with temples, palaces, and a harbor. The cost of the Roman production continued to climb. By the time filming resumed in late 1961, Cleopatra had already consumed more money than most studios spent on their entire annual output. And they were not even halfway finished. To understand what happened that fateful night, you need to grasp the sheer scale of the Cleopatra production in Rome. The main set alone covered several acres and employed thousands of workers. On any given day, hundreds of extras in elaborate costumes filled the scenes. The technical crew numbered in the hundreds. Catering operations fed thousands of people daily. Security guards patrolled constantly to keep the curious public away from the filming. Every single day of production cost between $75,000 and $100,000, an absolutely staggering sum in 1962 dollars. Converting to today's currency, that is roughly equivalent to $700,000 to $1 million per day. Every hour of delay meant tens of thousands of dollars lost. Every unplanned stoppage sent accountants into panic. The producers lived in constant fear of any disruption to the shooting schedule. By the time filming resumed in Rome, Elizabeth Taylor had become the most powerful actress in Hollywood history. Her $1 million salary was just the beginning. Her contract gave her approval over scripts, costumes, and even camera angles. She had her own private dressing room, the size of a small apartment, equipped with every luxury. A private chef prepared her meals. A personal doctor monitored her health constantly, terrified of a repeat of the London crisis. When Elizabeth Taylor spoke on the Cleopatra set, people listened. When she made a demand, it was met. She had earned this power through her talent, her beauty, and her near-death experience that had made the world realize how much they valued her. But Elizabeth Taylor never used her power for selfish purposes. She used it to ensure quality in her work, and as the world would soon discover, to help those who had no power at all. It was an ordinary afternoon on the Cleopatra set in Rome. Elizabeth Taylor sat on her elaborate golden throne, dressed in the full regalia of the Egyptian queen. Dozens of technicians adjusted lights and cameras. Hundreds of extras stood ready in their positions. The director was preparing to call action on an important scene. The cost meter was running, as it always did, tallying the thousands of dollars that every passing minute consumed. Then a production assistant approached one of the producers with an unusual request. Outside the studio gates, a family was waiting. They had traveled a great distance to bring their daughter, a young girl who was very ill. Doctors had told them that her condition was serious and that she might not have much time left. The little girl had one wish, one dream that had sustained her through her difficult treatments. She wanted to see Cleopatra, not Elizabeth Taylor the actress, but Cleopatra the queen in all her golden glory. The producer listened to the request and shook his head. It was impossible. They were in the middle of a crucial scene. The costs of stopping production were enormous. He prepared to have security escort the family away. Have you ever witnessed someone in power choosing compassion over convenience? Those moments remind us what humanity really means. Share your stories in the comments. But before the producer could dismiss the family, Elizabeth Taylor noticed the commotion. She called the production assistant over and asked what was happening. When she heard about the little girl waiting outside, her expression changed completely. The actress who commanded $1 million disappeared. In her place stood a woman who remembered what it felt like to be close to death, to have doctors whisper grave concerns, to fight for every breath. Elizabeth Taylor stood up from her throne. Her elaborate costume, weighing many pounds and taking hours to put on, suddenly seemed unimportant. She looked at the producer and spoke with a quiet authority that allowed no argument. She told him to stop the filming, immediately. The producer tried to explain the costs, the schedule, the impossibility of what she was asking. Elizabeth Taylor cut him off. She said that the money could wait, the cameras could wait. But that little girl could not wait, and she would not let a child's dream go unfulfilled while she sat on a fake golden throne pretending to be a queen. The announcement rippled through the massive set with the force of an earthquake. Cameras stopped rolling. Lights were held in position. Hundreds of extras stood frozen, unsure what was happening. The accountants watched their cost projections soar as the minutes ticked by. But no one dared to overrule Elizabeth Taylor. She was not just the star of this film. She was its heart, its reason for existing, the woman for whom $350 million in today's money was being spent. If she said stop, the production stopped. Elizabeth gathered her elaborate costume and began walking toward the studio gates. Her entourage hurried to follow. The director, the producers, the assistant directors all trailed behind, watching in amazement as the most expensive actress in the world walked away from the most expensive film in history to meet a sick child. Outside the studio gates, the little girl waited with her parents. She was small for her age, made smaller by her illness, but her eyes were bright with hope, fixed on the gates through which Cleopatra might appear. When Elizabeth Taylor emerged, still in full costume and makeup, the child's face transformed with pure joy. Here was the queen she had dreamed about, walking toward her in gold and jewels and flowing robes. Elizabeth Taylor knelt down to meet the girl at eye level, heedless of the elaborate costume that was not designed for such movements. She took the child's hands in her own and spoke to her softly. She told her that she was the real queen here, not Elizabeth. She told her that her bravery and her spirit made her more royal than any costume ever could. She asked about her favorite things, her dreams, her hopes. She listened with complete attention, as if no one else in the world existed. If this story has touched your heart, please make sure you are subscribed to this channel. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that goodness exists in the world. What happened next would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. Elizabeth Taylor spent over an hour with the little girl, showing her the sets, introducing her to other cast members, letting her sit on the golden throne of Cleopatra. The child touched the costumes, the props, the cameras. She experienced the magic of filmmaking from the inside, and Elizabeth Taylor stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, making her laugh, treating her like the most important person in the world. The production remained stopped. The costs continued to mount. Nobody cared. Crew members who had worked in Hollywood for decades, hardened professionals who had seen everything, stood watching with tears in their eyes. The producers who had worried about budgets found themselves weeping. Even the extras, strangers to the little girl, were moved beyond words. When it was finally time for the family to leave, Elizabeth Taylor hugged the child tightly and whispered something in her ear that only the two of them would ever know. The little girl smiled, the biggest smile her parents had seen in months, and Elizabeth Taylor watched them go, tears streaming down her face. They're ruining the makeup that had taken hours to apply. The accountants later calculated that Elizabeth Taylor's decision cost the production roughly $200,000 in 1962 money, perhaps $2 million in today's currency. The producers initially considered asking her to cover the costs from her salary. They quickly abandoned that idea because something else had happened that night, something that could not be measured in dollars. The crew of Cleopatra had witnessed who Elizabeth Taylor really was. Not a demanding diva, not a scandal-plagued star, but a woman of genuine compassion and courage. Their respect for her increased immeasurably. The remaining months of filming proceeded more smoothly than anyone had expected. When difficulties arose, people remembered that night and worked harder to overcome them. This Elizabeth Taylor had shown them what truly mattered, and they responded with their best efforts. Elizabeth Taylor never spoke publicly about that evening on the Cleopatra set. She did not want credit for an act of compassion. She did not want the little girl's privacy invaded by the press. In later years, when asked about memorable moments from Cleopatra, she would talk about the costumes, the sets, her romance with Richard Burton. She kept the story of the sick child to herself. But those who were present that night never forgot. They told their families, their friends, their colleagues. The story spread through Hollywood as a quiet legend, proof that behind the scandals and the headlines, Elizabeth Taylor was genuinely kind. It was one of countless acts of generosity that marked her life, from her later work with AIDS charities to her private donations to hospitals and schools. Elizabeth Taylor used her fame and her fortune not for herself, but for others who needed help. Some moments in history are measured in dollars. This one cannot be. $350 million. That is what Cleopatra cost, making it the most expensive film ever made at that time. And Elizabeth Taylor stopped it all for a sick child's wish. Not because cameras were watching, not because it would make her look good, but because that was who she was. When Elizabeth Taylor looked at that little girl, she did not see an inconvenience or a delay. She saw herself, 1 year earlier, fighting for breath in a London hospital. She saw a fellow human being who deserved dignity and joy, regardless of what it cost. That night in Rome, Elizabeth Taylor proved that true royalty has nothing to do with crowns or thrones. It has to do with how we treat the most vulnerable among us. Cleopatra was just a movie. But what Elizabeth Taylor did that night was real, and it reminds us decades later that kindness is worth more than any budget in the world.